Courtland Allen, sir. Nice to see you. Thanks for joining me on MicroConf on Air today.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's nice to see you as well.
Absolutely. So I have my standard intro stuff I'm going to run through, and then we're going to dig in to a pretty cool topic with Courtland, who has a lot of experience, working with developers, indie hackers who are building their companies. So welcome to today's episode of MicroConf on Air. As always, I'm your host, Rob Walling. Courtland Allen and I, as I said, are going to dig through his experience building indie hackers. He's done something pretty unique that most people don't do, which is to build a community site almost virtually from scratch, it was a very hard thing to do. And he's kept it up for years. They were acquired by Stripe several years ago. And he's interviewed 150, 160 startup founders on his podcast, Indie Hackers, the Indie Hackers podcast many of you listen to. And I know that when you talk to that many founders, you start seeing patterns. And that's the kind of stuff we're going to dig into today. It's just some lessons he's learned, thought processes, positive patterns, anti-patterns, and that kind of stuff. If you are not already in MicroConf Connect, which is MicroConf's Slack channel, it's our online community. We have almost 1,000 founders and aspiring founders in there. That's where folks are going to be able to ask questions of Courtland and myself today. So head to microconfconnect.com and apply if you'd like to be part of future conversations. Of course, you can always just watch this live stream on microconfonair.com. As a reminder, MicroConf On Air podcast is live as of a couple weeks ago. So if you want to hear any of these episodes, if you miss any of them and want to just hear them asynchronously and not have to log into YouTube and watch a video, which not something I do. My generation doesn't tend to do a lot of that. I personally am subscribed to the MicroConf On Air podcast, and I'm kind of listening back to figure out, what we can do to improve it. I think there's always room for improvement. As always, thanks to Basecamp and Stripe. They're our headline partners, and we do a lot of this with their help. So thank you so much. So Courtland Allen, founder of Indie Hackers. Are you holed up there in San Francisco? Everything going well?
I am. I haven't seen anybody that I know in the last month, except for my local grocers, who I guess I'm on a first name basis with, but that's pretty much it. Holed up, playing video games, playing poker, doing a lot of work. Honestly, having fun with it.
Yeah, that's cool. I've been seeing you put out some articles and video interviews. You've been doing a lot of pretty topical stuff. I think you were mentioning that your content is moving more towards maybe news or like current events type stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's something I've always avoided in the past just because it's a little bit harder. There's just like a shorter turnaround time. If you're doing things that are current, you basically have to plan for episodes, record them, and get them out the door extremely quickly. They're less evergreen. They become less relevant over time. But there are some other advantages that I think make them sort of the news approach very attractive. And also, I think just with the way the global conversation is going on, I had a really great episode lined up for the Indie Hackers podcast. It was sort of a debate between Natalie Nagel of WildBit and DHH from Basecamp on work-life balance. And I was so excited to release this thing. And then, a month passed, and I think the release date was supposed to be last week. And I emailed both of them, and I was like, I just don't feel right even tweeting about this. It just seems so off topic, and they both agreed. So I think there's just been a shift, and it's harder to sort of do business as usual when everybody's talking about, the fact that we're in a worldwide pandemic and there's a huge global recession coming.
Yeah, the conversation has certainly changed. We've been, we've almost, I would say it's unintentional, but when we moved into the news stuff, we did a big live stream last week about COVID-19, really the SBA loan, the Paycheck Protection Program. Yep. And that was kind of really the first time we had done something like that, and done something that was super topical. We threw it together in like 2 days, but it turned out really well. And we had, 350, 400 people on the live stream. And again, with 48 hours notice, it was pretty good. And it's received a lot
it's great.
Watches since then. So it's a trip. The conversation is ever changing. So I want to dig in. Prior to this, you and I emailed a little bit, and I was saying, this is the topic I'd love to cover. Do you have any bullet point thoughts on, things that you have learned, whether it was growing indie hackers or from interviewing other founders? And you sent me this great outline. I figured you'd send me like 6 bullet points, but it was like really well thought out things. Did you have that put together in advance? Like, is that a book outline you have, or is that
no?
Did you just
what
hammer
happened
that out as an email?
Is I missed your email about the stimulus thing, and I felt really bad about it. And so when I saw your email about the list, I was like, I need to put some effort into this because I missed Rob's last email. And so I just started typing, and it was very stream of consciousness, which I think runs the risk that there might be a lot of recency bias here. This might not be the things that I've learned from 155 interviews. It might be the things that I've learned from like the last 20 interviews that have been on my mind lately.
Right. Right.
But they're things I feel pretty strongly about, and they might change. They're all opinions. They're all beliefs. I wouldn't say any of them are facts that are set in stone. Probably at any point in time that you've asked me what I've learned from the people I've talked to and the things that I've done, I would have given you completely different answers. So this is Courtland April 2020 version of what I've learned from indie hackers.
Awesome. One of the things you said is that the advice to start a B2B rather than a B2C company is a bit like telling people to eat their green vegetables and not eat a bunch of carbs. They'll probably be healthier if they listen, but the advice itself misses the underlying principle of why an idea is actually good or bad. Talk us through that a little bit, because I'm not sure I understand the connection. Like when I say don't eat vegetables, or when I tell my kids eat vegetables, not carbs, the reason they don't want to eat their vegetables is because they don't taste good, whereas French fries do. But is that what you're saying, is like B2C companies are really fun? They taste good. In essence, they're fun to start, whereas B2B are not? Or what's your thought there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of things. Number one, they are fun to start. A lot of people want to start B2C businesses. Even when I started Indie Hackers, one of the items on my checklist was I wanted to start a business that I could tell my friends and family about, that they could use, that they would be excited about, that would be interesting to them, just because as consumers, we mostly interact with B2C businesses in the course of our lives. Like we very rarely see what's going on behind the scenes of businesses. And so I think they're very attractive to start. But they have some unique challenges, which is kind of why we end up giving the advice to go B2B, because it kind of goes against what people's sort of intuitive, sort of like, I guess, almost automatic desire is when they first become founders. I do think the advice is a little bit coarse. I think, I had an ex-girlfriend who talked about the color diet, and it was literally eat foods that are these colors, sort of a shorthand. And there really was like a directive in there, like don't eat white foods, eat green foods. And I think if you do that, like, okay, great. You'll probably eat a lot of vegetables. You probably won't eat a lot of carbs, but it's just really coarse advice. It doesn't really get down to the nitty gritty of someone, let's say, who's looking at their macros and counting carbs and counting protein, grams of protein and counting fat, et cetera, who's actually looking at sort of like the first principles and the underlying reasons why certain foods are bad or good. And if you just sort of follow the higher level advice, you might still mess up, right? You might just eat nothing but green Jolly Ranchers all the time and then wonder why, you're not healthy. So I think with B2B, it's obviously, more lucrative than B2C on average. I think on Indie Hackers did an analysis like a year ago, and in our product directory, we have like thousands of people's products with the revenue numbers. The ones that were B2B were making on average 4 times more revenue than the ones that were B2C. But I do think there are some extremely lucrative B2C businesses. You just have to be careful and follow the underlying principles that lead to people paying basically for something of value. Businesses make money generally more than consumers, and they have a higher cap on how much money they can make. They're also more concerned, therefore, with saving money than I think consumers are, because there's just more money to be saved. And so it's easier to pick a valuable problem that businesses care about. And so generally speaking, like B2B is not a bad way to go. But I think if you're actually looking at those principles, you can ask, okay, well, how do consumers make money? What do consumers care a lot about? Right? What is a problem that if I have consumers, they're not going to get fickle and leave, that they're not going to only be willing to pay me $5 a month for, et cetera. If you look at those underlying principles, there's lots of areas. For example, probably the way the consumers see themselves making the most money is through their job. And people imagine all sorts of avenues for how they can get a raise at their job or get a job in a better industry. And usually that comes in the form of education. And yeah, maybe people only want to pay $5 or $10 a month for your to-do list app, and maybe they'll churn because it's not that important. But people are willing to pay $40,000 or $50,000 a year for the right education, which is a crazy amount. And so I think the same principles apply if you actually understand why businesses or consumers spend money, and you're like, a little bit disciplined and making sure that your business focuses on solving valuable problems for people, solving problems that have high reach, solving problems that people are unlikely to churn from because they're important. Then consumers can be just as lucrative of a target market as any business.
Nice. Love it. Thanks for that explanation. For folks in MicroConf Connect, in the MicroConf on Air channel, if you do, we have plenty to talk about today, but I'm happy to bring in, if you have any questions for Courtland as we go through it. Another thing you said that I really liked, you said oftentimes there really is one weird trick or secret sauce that powers a lot of a business's success. Usually it's some sort of moat. Some moats can be insurmountable, and founders are happy to talk about those in public. For example, first mover advantage, network effect. But lots of businesses, rings so true for me, which is why, in my experience, myself and with other founders, but lots of businesses have more fragile moats, and they're loath to reveal on the air. They would basically never want to expose them because they're things that can be attacked. You want to talk a little more about that, embellish on that?
Yeah, I mean it's a side effect of having a podcast. You have these conversations
Yeah.
with founders before they come on. You're talking about different things, and then I always ask when someone comes on my show, is there anything you really want to get into the episode, and anything you really don't want to talk about? And very often there's some strategic things that are important to a business's success that they won't want to talk about on the air. And very often there are things that founders just say, no, it's all fine. I'll talk about anything. And what I've noticed is that generally speaking, when people don't want to talk about things, it's because they're worried about the competition. They're worried about the fact that they haven't quite built a moat that others can't really cross. And when they're coming on the podcast to share their revenue numbers and how big their business is, but they do feel like this sense of it all might fall apart. Somebody might come back and build what we've done better and take all of our customers. There's just more to load to share those types of things. Mostly those tend to fall into the category of distribution channels, distributional advantages. So I won't name any names, but for example, there's a podcast I did with a founder who has a fast growing business. It's up and coming. They're making 5 figures a month, doing really well. And a lot of their growth comes from innovation and some SEO strategies and some keywords that they're ranking for that are a bit unintuitive, or you wouldn't really think that would lead to customers. And for that, I mean, if you reveal those keywords, you talk about that, and someone really gets an idea like, hey, I want to do the same thing. I'm competing with you. They're gonna compete with you, and now suddenly like this free traffic you've been getting is going to be extremely difficult to maintain. You're going to have to constantly write new content and use different tricks to get more backlinks to sort of maintain your lead, because it's kind of like every search engine results page is a little bit of a winner take all, or zero sum game. If you move down the ranking, someone else moves up, and vice versa. So that's a good example. I've seen others where they just like have other distributional advantages. They have good sources of customers, good sources of leads, and they just don't want their competitors to know about those. And those aren't like solid moats. Anybody, if they found those distribution channels, could make the same moves and compete with you. Another moat that's really not that solid is product. And I think more and more founders are getting away from thinking that their product is something that others can't copy. People are pretty good at writing code nowadays. They're pretty fast. But then there are some of these more insurmountable moats. If you have a significant first mover's advantage, nobody can go back in time and do what you did before you did it. So if you're able to capitalize on that well, then you're generally happy to go on the air and talk to anybody about how your business worked. Or if you have network effects, this is something that works well with indie hackers, where essentially we just have a lot of people in the community, and the people, sort of the value of the community isn't me, it's other people helping each other. And so like those are really hard for other people to surmount. You can't just say, oh, network effects, let me check that off the list and get that. It's actually a hard slog to get through. And so I'm happy to talk about that. But it's just interesting to me to see that, there actually are very often these factors that have an outsized influence on a business's success. And oftentimes founders don't want to be completely forthcoming about what's going on there.
Yep. No, I've totally seen that as well. And another interesting moat that is really, really hard to break that I think especially early stage entrepreneurs don't think of is brand, because brand seems so amorphous. But think about Stripe as an example.
Yeah.
We could replicate Stripe's functionality. It would take some time. I mean, there are other payment processors that have made it as easy, or I would say comparable. But none of us are leaving Stripe because the service itself is amazing, and we just trust the brand. And the Collison brothers and the whole team has just done an amazing job of maintaining that. And that's why when we've interviewed both John and Patrick, at MicroConf, they've told me offline, they're like, you can ask me anything. Like there's no secret sauce that I can't share,
Right.
and I'll say, how did you get here? And they're like, well, we worked really hard. We listened to our users and we doubled down on that. And it's really hard to topple. Really hard.
Yep.
It would be really hard to compete with Stripe. Whereas, I can think of examples like, let's say, QuickBooks or Infusionsoft, or back in the day, PayPal. I think they're a little better now. But people would build entire websites. Infusionsoft sucks, QuickBooks sucks, PayPal sucks.
Yep.
Like there was such hatred for it that their brand was like a negative factor, and that leaves huge, an underbelly. And that's why Xero, it was able to get traction against QuickBooks. That's why Stripe was able to get traction against all the payment processors, because we hated Authorize.net and PayPal Web Payments Pro, because we're so kludgy, and on and on. So anyways, that's just another example for folks to think about. And that you also have that, like Indie Hackers has its own brand. MicroConf itself, has its own brand, right? That would be hard. We've seen tons of startup conferences, startup communities come and go in the past 10, 15 years. And that's part of that is they just don't, they don't build that, both the network effect you're talking about, but also that brand.
And brand is not an accident. I mean, the Collisons spent a lot of time thinking about Stripe's brand. How many other $35 billion unicorn companies haven't had a massive scandal, how many CEOs are reading all the blog posts and the tweets that come out of their company to make sure that they don't offend people, to make sure every Hacker News post is positive, et cetera. Like that takes effort. And I think with MicroConf as well, like you guys are very conscious about your brand. You're very conscious about how you run your conferences, how you run your calls, who's part of the MicroConf community. And that just pays dividends over time as you can sort of associate MicroConf with like excellence and trustworthiness and friendliness. Right. And with Indie Hackers, even from the get-go, I was like concerned with some of the more superficial aspects of brand, which were like, okay, the colors and the name, et cetera. I put a lot of thought into that early on. But later on, like really what's the mission? What does Indie Hackers represent? And I think all that's part of your brand. Just being consistent and showing up every day is huge. So I think you're right. That's a really big one. And once you've got that in your pocket, then you're happy to talk about everything else because the brand is almost unassailable.
Yeah, it's really hard. And something I read, I went deep in branding over the past couple of years just to kind of learn what it was. I found it was a blind spot in my experience. Like I had, obviously I came, technical founder and then moved away from that, but then learned marketing and learned all these tactics and then learned more strategic thinking. And then I was like, man, we've built a brand with MicroConf, this was a couple of years ago, but like we did it a little bit, it was partially intentionally and partially it was just who we were, right? It became us. And after that, I became much more intentional about it. But when I read about branding, someone said, brand is not what you project, it's what people say about you and what they think about your company name or whatever. When you say Stripe to a software developer, like what do they feel and what do they think? What are the three adjectives in their mind when you say Indie Hackers, when you say MicroConf? So Justin Jackson just said, hey, Robin Courtland. I think he's watching on the live stream. How's it going, sir?
Justin.
Question for you that I'm sure you've talked about, but I haven't heard it, is you started Indie Hackers from starting a community like that is very, very hard, right? Paul Graham started Hacker News because he had this following of people who were reading his essays. So I had read his essays for years and his book. And so when he said he was launching Hacker News, I was like, okay, that's fine. I'll be there. What did you start with? Like, how did you jumpstart? And I want there to be info for people to not to compete with Indie Hackers. So don't give away any secret sauce if you have it. But if someone wants to start a community for other types of in a different niche is really what I'm asking.
I don't have any secret sauce with Indie Hackers because I've got the network effects from the community where there's a really hard to just sort of flip a switch and turn them on. I didn't have a following when I started Indie Hackers. I had maybe 400 followers on Twitter, mostly friends, family, colleagues, and stuff from work. I've been in the tech industry for a while, but I just didn't have an audience. And I think it's interesting because there's so much advice to build an audience first before you start your product. And obviously that can really work. But obviously there's times where it doesn't work that well. For example, Mike has got an audience. He's had an audience for years. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to become blue tick customers if they're not the right kind of audience for that. So the Indie Hackers, I kind of follow this playbook that I got from Peter Levels, who is this digital nomad. He's one of the people who inspired me to do Indie Hackers in the first place. And what he did was he sort of aggregated this very useful content. He curated it. He made it extremely easy for digital nomads who were doing all this research, trying to figure out where to go, where's safe, what has the best weather, what has the best internet connections. And he just did all that research for them and put it in one place. And that was kind of the key for him to basically not build an audience, but build a source of traffic, a place where people said, hey, I'll come here instead of doing all this research myself. And then from there, he attached a community to it to sort of allow it to become, a more retentive place, a place where people could help each other and they wouldn't just sort of get the information and do a hit and run and leave. And so when I saw the way that he did that, I figured, this could work for probably a lot of ideas, a lot of niches, a lot of industries. And my passion is more about startups. And the thing I find myself spending a lot of time trying to do in research is trying to find stories of these indie founders who didn't raise money from venture capitalists, who are generating recurring revenue, and finding out how they did it. These stories just weren't really published in the media. They weren't really popular. I mean, I'd have to go to MicroConf or watch MicroConf videos basically to find any of these people. So I thought, okay, what if I could sort of curate some of these stories, put them in one place, and then ask thoughtful questions that sort of satiate the desires of people like me who are actually trying to figure out like how these people did it. Right? I'm going to make sure everybody shares their revenue numbers. I'm going to make sure everybody shares their marketing strategies and tactics, et cetera. Put them all in one place. Try to get as much traffic as possible off the back of that. Funnel that traffic into a mailing list so I can reach my audience basically repeatedly. And I did that, and it took like a month for me to quote unquote build an audience of a couple thousand people on a mailing list. And that was enough to kind of get a community forum going. So I built a community forum Early on, there was just like me and like 5 or 6 fake versions of me on different accounts, just having these fake conversations back and forth, trying to make the forum seem lively. And then I would email out these fake conversations basically to my mailing list and say, hey, we've got a forum now. We're talking about work-life balance, join the conversation. And every now and then somebody would trickle in. Yeah, a little bit of growth hacking. But I mean, this is like straight from the Reddit playbook, from how they grew Reddit in the early days, when it's just not that valuable to have a community with just one person in it. And so eventually, 1 or 2 people trickled in. They were talking to one of these accounts that I had. And I remember the first time I saw 2 people talking to each other, and I thought that I had made it. I was like, this is it.
That
this
was
is
it.
The beginning. Yeah. But it was a lot of that for months and months, just me putting a lot of reps in, making sure the conversation was lively, trying to advertise the conversations until it eventually picked up enough steam of its own to start growing and sort of becoming like a self-perpetuating machine. And those are the network effects, where people are getting a lot of value from helping each other, and there's not much that I have to do.
Yeah, very cool. And were you working a day job at the time?
No, I had quit. So I had,
Okay.
Technically my job at Stripe was my first full-time job ever in my life. But I had done some remote contracting work, just to sort of fund myself for the previous years. I was dabbling on side projects, and I quit my last job with about a year of runway, messed around for 6 months on ideas that really didn't hold water, that weren't really good. Then I decided to get serious, and I spent like a week just like brainstorming an idea. Eventually came up with Andy Hackers. And at that point I had 6 months of revenue left, 6 months of runway left in my bank account. So I had to make it work. And luckily it worked pretty fast. I think having that pressure was stressful, but it also pushed me to make better decisions faster. And I think if I didn't have that pressure, I probably would have built something that took 6 months just to launch and, never made a dime.
Well, that comes back to another point you made, where you said you think the best hack for motivation is extrinsic or external motivation. Tons of people work a 9 to 5 every day because they're doing something they hate, but they do it because there's a boss, right? And they have someone to answer to, they have mouths to feed, and they don't want to disappoint colleagues. And again, I'm just kind of quoting you, like too many aspiring founders try to rely 100% on intrinsic motivation, which can be fickle, and they wonder why they aren't consistent day to day or week to week. It's probably better just to get a co-founder or advisors/investors or customers ASAP to keep you honest. It's fascinating.
I think that's big.
That.
I think that's part of the human psychology. Like, we are social creatures. We care a lot about what other people think about us. We really don't want to let down our colleagues or our coworkers. We really don't want to be embarrassed about doing bad work in public. And these things could drive us to act in a way that I think intrinsic motivation just doesn't. It's great to be passionate about what you do. Like, I'm very passionate. Like, I could write code all day, but there's more to business than just writing code. And the fact that like I have people depending on me to get the next podcast episode out, to write this newsletter, to do all these other things that aren't necessarily my favorite thing in the world is kind of what pushes me to do these things. And I have friends who've like started companies where they don't have any investors, they don't have any advisors, and like their motivation ebbs and flows constantly. Like your mood changes depending on how much sleep you got and what's going on in your life and what you've eaten today. Like, all these things can affect your mood. And if that's 100% of what you're relying on to sort of get you to do things that aren't always easy and aren't always fun, then I think you're gonna feel it a little bit, like it's a roller coaster, and you're kind of going up and down, and you're not sure when you're gonna be motivated and when you're not. The trade-off is, if you have extrinsic motivation, you're gonna be doing things you don't necessarily like at others' behest and because you feel obligated to others, and that's not the best feeling ever. So if at all possible, it would be great to do something where you're just 100% intrinsically motivated and that happens to align with exactly what you need to do. That's rarely possible for most founders. Most of the time, there's going to be some sacrifices you have to make, and I think just having other people to push you is a really good hack, and it doesn't get talked about enough. We sort of pretend like everybody who does anything is just like this motivation machine, and they've got their their morning routine that they've set up, and they're just naturally interested in everything, and it's just not. I don't think that's true for most of the people that I talk to.
Yeah, it's a good point. And it's, when you talk about extrinsic can make you do things you don't want to do. I think you can kind of even hack that and say, I want to find extrinsic motivation that agrees with me most of the time, or that works side by side. So if you're going to find a co-founder, find someone that you really like working with and that pushes you in good ways, and I've had a number of those relationships. If you're going to take on investors, well, find the right investors. Don't take on a-holes, and don't take on people who are going to say, if you want to be a $20 million company and they're going to want you to be $1 billion, like make sure that, the things align. There are ways to do that. Looks like we have a question from the chat. From Tony of Cloud Forecast. He says, with all the interviews you've done, and multiple posts you've seen, and all the multiple posts you've seen on Indie Hackers, what is the one common thread you see from successful founders?
The one common thread.
That's a tough one.
I think successful founders usually have a bias towards action. They may or may not like to talk about what they're going to do. They may or may not spend a lot of time dreaming, but they all eventually like pull the trigger and do things. And this is another thing that I don't think gets talked about all that much. But I go to a lot of indie hackers meetups. I've met like thousands and thousands of people who want to start things, and that's just a huge hurdle to get over. Like that difference between, you know, I'm dreaming of this lifestyle, but I've actually taken steps. I'm building something. I'm doing things. It's really easy to throw a bunch of blockers in your way and say, I can't get started because I don't know how to code, or because I haven't quit my job yet, or because I don't have the perfect idea. Whereas I think more of the successful founders, they have all these same problems, and they just were scrappy and did whatever they could just to make forward progress. So that's one of the things I would say. Another one is, I think successful founders all have some degree of like inherent optimism. I talk a lot about optimism cycle, where you have to start by believing that you can do something, thinking that it's possible for you to do it. If you believe that something's possible, you'll try much harder to get it done. I gave a talk at MicroConf a couple years ago, and this is sort of like the last quarter of my talk. I had this analogy where I said, you know, if I hid $1 million from you and it was somewhere in your apartment, how much time would you spend looking for that $1 million? You'd probably tear up every, you know, piece of furniture you have, look behind the TV, under the rug, you dig up floorboards because you know it's possible to find it. Whereas if I said, hey, Rob, like I've hit $1 million somewhere in like the Pacific Ocean, you don't think it's possible to find it, so you're not going to try at all. So I think a lot of founders have optimism that they can do things. That leads to them trying to do those things a little bit harder. If it doesn't work, they try another thing. If it doesn't work, they try another thing. And then eventually they succeed because they're trying harder than others. And then when you succeed, that gives you more optimism and say like, hey, I did this hard thing. And it sort of repeats and the cycle fuels itself. And so I think that's an important and overlooked thing. Fake it till you make it. If you don't have the optimism, if you don't have the wins under your belt, start small, do something super easy, get those wins and get yourself to a point where you think you can do certain things. And I think you'll just try more ambitious things over time. And I think it's necessary to try in order to succeed.
Awesome. And I've just linked up your YouTube or your MicroConf talk in the chat so people can check it out. Vulcan didn't know he went to MicroConf. Yeah, he spoke there a couple years ago, and you've attended several MicroConfs. I'd like to grab dinner with you when you're there. That's fun.
Yeah. I wish we didn't have this global pandemic this year.
I wish we could hang out in the next week. Exactly.
Yeah.
One thing that I like, man, I have this framework. I've written this entire blog post that I haven't published, and I've mentioned it in a couple talks that I did. I'm kind of testing the idea, but like I have this theory in my head about success and like the 3 factors that go into it. It's a very high level generalized thing, but it's hard work, luck, and skill to varying degrees. So hard work is mostly required unless you get really lucky. You know, if you have 100% luck, then you don't need hard work and skill, but almost no one has that. If you have 99% hard work, you don't need much of the other 2. If the ideal is that you'll have a lot of hard work and a lot of skill, and you let luck be what it may. But you talked about, and I find that hard work is either over, it's like glamorized in the Silicon, you know, the hustle culture, or it's dismissed in these stories of like, I just kind of built Facebook in a weekend, and it's you know what I mean? And it's like, I find that the answer is typically somewhere between there, that, yeah, they got a little lucky with a cool idea that hit at the right time, even though there were like 5 other social networks that were just like it. They had the skill to program it. You know, he had enough skill to be able, he had taught himself these skills, and he worked his ass off. Like, I don't think anyone could say, you know, Mark Zuckerberg or the Carlson brothers or any MicroConf, you know, person who's had success did not have some hard work. And so, you know, you talk about, you emailed me, you said burnout and overwork are real and to be avoided, but I think most solo founders are going to have to work very hard in the beginning unless they're very efficient, very lucky, or very patient. And so that is very much in line with like my worldview. But what's the patient part? Do you mean just that they'd have to wait a very long time to get to the point of being able to sustain themselves?
I mean, I think when we think about working hard, we're thinking about sort of short bursts of time. We're thinking about, you know, putting in 60 hours in a week. You don't have to do that if you don't feel like you need to succeed in the next couple months, 6 months, et cetera. I mean, you could work on a blog for 5 years, and you could put a couple hours of work into it every week for 5 years. I think that's patience. That's saying, you know, these 5 years are going to pass anyway. I don't have anywhere to be. It doesn't need to be the sort of rocket ship growth. I'm not going to work super hard on it, but I am going to be consistent. So I think, you know, patience combined with consistency over a long time scale can sort of approximate the same thing as hard work. But otherwise, I'm in this sort of the same page as you. I think both of these ridiculous extremes, or don't work hard at all, or also, like the hustle porn, you need to be sacrificing all your friendships and relationships and your health like those are both extreme and obviously flawed. The reality is that most founders, I think, especially first-time founders, are going to spend a lot of time doing things that like aren't right. They're not going to be perfectly efficient. They're going to spend a lot of time working on things that don't work out and time working on things that do work out. If you're extremely skilled, if you're DHH and you built Rails and dozens of successful products, like you probably know exactly what to do and you can be super efficient and get a lot done in very little time. But most first-time founders, most solo founders are going to have to spend a lot of time just making mistakes and doing a lot of drudge work. And they're probably going to have to work harder than normal to the extent that they don't get lucky or to the extent that they don't have the skills necessary to just sort of know what to do. So I'm right there with you. I agree with you. I don't know how successful your blog post will be because it seems that people only want to hear the extreme, unrealistic answers. They don't want to know the truth. But I'm hoping that some of this lunacy will end and people will just be more acclimated to what the obviously right answer is, which is like, you probably got to work hard, but not crazy hard.
Right. Very cool. We have one more question and then we're going to wrap. It's from Gezim from Commercial. He says, how can we use interviews if we're entering a new industry to get more customers? I guess, how do you suggest I overcome imposter syndrome?
How do we use interviews to, I'm not sure I understand the question.
How can we use interviews if we're entering a new industry to get more customers? I think what he's saying is he feels like an imposter when he's going in to interview other people. I mean, I think I would say there, like, just, you don't have to be the expert to interview people, right? Number one.
No.
And then he's saying, how can you use interviews if you're entering a new industry? So much like you started doing interviews, right, to build your audience, he maybe is in the vertical of, maybe it's e-commerce. I mean, it's Commercial. But it's e-commerce, or it's, just some vertical, like, have you seen other folks do this really well, or do you have advice for them, I guess?
Yeah, I would say you should work backwards from the needs of your industry. There's a very specific reason I did interviews for indie hackers, because I saw these stories being shared online. I saw other people reading these stories. I saw the questions that they were asking, the people who were sharing these stories. I wrote down a list of what they wanted to learn, what problems they were trying to solve. And then I worked backwards from there to say, okay, well, how could I put these stories out in the best way? And interviews was the answer, because then I could sort of control the conversation and make sure certain information got in there. If I was starting in a different niche, I would have probably the same process, but I would come to a different conclusion. Maybe I wouldn't do interviews. Maybe I would just do stories, or maybe I would do educational blog posts, or maybe I would do some other form of content. So I would say, like, don't blindly copy the interview format. I think you should always work backwards from the problem you're trying to solve for people. And that has sort of the added benefit that if you enter a new industry, it's new to you. You're not sure exactly what people need. So it's like you need to take that first step of looking at people and seeing what they're doing and talking to them and figuring out the source of their problems, just so you can tailor whatever you end up building to what they need. So I would say don't necessarily feel attached to interviews. There have been a lot of indie hackers clone sites that do interviews that have not done very well, or that have tried taking it to different niches that haven't done very well, because they just didn't take the time to really figure out what works and what people in those industries need.
Awesome. Well, Courtland Allen, thanks again so much for spending half hour with us today. If you want to follow Courtland, I'm sure most of you are already, but he's on Twitter. He's CS Allen, and of course, indiehackers.com, where he's a prolific interviewer, blogger, and all the things. Next Tuesday, I have Asia Matos coming on the show. We're going to talk about how to earn your first 100 customers. She did a great talk at MicroConf with that title. Was either last year or 2 years ago. And so you can watch the talk, ask her questions about it, or you can just show up and, hear what she's up to and kind of pick her brain on marketing stuff. So Courtland, thanks again, man. Really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Rob. Anytime.
See you, everybody. See you next Tuesday. Same time.